She is a Hollywood legend, a Broadway icon, and the only artist ever to top the charts in every single decade since the 1960s. But behind that unmatched brilliance, behind the radiant, funny girl smile that dazzled millions, lies a wound so deep it never truly healed. It was the wound of a child who grew up yearning for love, but found only silence. Barbra Streisand was born in Brooklyn in 1942, into a world that would shape her forever. Just 15 months into her life, tragedy struck with merciless swiftness. Her father, Emmanuel, collapsed during an epileptic seizure, and a poorly administered injection ended his life almost instantly. For Barbra, it meant losing something she would never truly know: his embrace, his laughter, even the sound of his voice. She grew up in a home where no photograph of him was ever displayed, as though he had been erased from existence. Years later, she would confess with heartbreaking clarity, "There was never a photograph of my father in the house. It was as if he had never lived." All that remained were his old books, tied together with string and shoved into a basement corner, gathering dust like forgotten relics. Even memory itself had been silenced. Her mother, Diana, was paralyzed by grief and depression, unable to offer the tenderness her daughter so desperately needed. And when Diana remarried, she never told her children. One day, Barbra simply discovered a new man, her stepfather, Lou, living in their tiny apartment. But instead of becoming a figure of protection, Lou became a wall of rejection. He was cold, dismissive, and impossible to please. Barbra tried everything to win his affection, fetching his slippers, calling him Dad, even tiptoeing quietly around the apartment so as not to disturb him. Nothing worked. Years later, she would recall with the raw honesty of a child who never forgot. Did he like me? Not at all. The apartment itself felt suffocating. Barbra shared a single small room with her mother and brother. There was no privacy, no safe space to dream. She didn't close a bedroom door of her own until she was 16 years old. 16 years without a space to call hers. Is it any wonder that later in life she became so attached to beautiful homes and tranquil gardens? They were not mere luxuries. They were the answers to the deprivation she had endured. But perhaps the sharpest wound of all came not from silence, but from words. Her mother often told her she wasn't pretty enough, that her nose was too big, that her strange voice would never carry her anywhere. She never told Barbra she loved her. She never once said she was proud. And yet, in that rejection, something else was born. Defiance. A quiet fire that whispered to her. Maybe her voice wasn't a flaw. Maybe it was her salvation. And with that spark, the little girl who had only known emptiness began to dream of a day when the world would have no choice but to listen. If childhood taught Barbra Streisand how to survive without love, then the beginning of her career taught her how to survive without approval. In the summer of 1958, at just 16 years old, she left the suffocating Brooklyn apartment where dreams had no room to breathe and stepped into Manhattan with nothing more than a secondhand suitcase, a thrift store dress, and a voice the world did not yet believe in. There was no cheering family waving from the doorway, no mother whispering good luck or slipping her $1 for the journey. Instead, there was silence, and the echo of words that cut deeper than hunger. You're not pretty enough. Your nose is too big. Your voice is too strange. For most young girls, those words would have been reasons to give up. For Barbra, they became reasons to run faster. The first years in New York were merciless. She rented tiny, airless rooms in run-down boarding houses, sometimes so cold in winter that she slept in her coat with the buttons pulled tight to her chin. Dinner was often nothing more than a slice of bread or a cup of tea, meals that tasted more of loneliness than of food. By day, she auditioned relentlessly for roles she was never meant to win. Again and again, she poured her soul into songs, only to be met with rejection. Not because her voice failed, her voice never failed, but because of the face that carried it. One casting director, after hearing her sing with every ounce of longing in her body, simply shook his head and said, "You'll never make it. You don't have the face for it." Cruel, crushing, humiliating. Barbra could have broken. She could have listened to her mother's doubts, or followed her friend's advice to fix her nose, to smooth out her unusual voice, to become someone more palatable. But she refused. Years later, she would recall, "I didn't want to change myself. If I was going to fail, I'd rather fail as me." That refusal, reckless to some, became her armor. Her so-called flaws became her fire. Still, the nights were long and merciless. At 17, after yet another rejection, she sat alone on a narrow bed in a cheap room on 48th Street, clutching a pillow as though it could absorb the weight of her disappointment. Outside, the city sparkled with lights and applause. For someone else. Inside, she was just a girl with no money, no connections, and worst of all, no beauty in the eyes of the world. But then, almost imperceptibly, the tide began to shift. In 1960, at 18, she stepped onto a small stage in a smoky Greenwich Village club, wearing dresses she had stitched from thrift shop scraps. She sang as if the room had been waiting for her voice all along. People leaned in, they whispered her name, and they came back. By 1962, at just 19, Barbra landed her breakthrough role in I Can Get It For You Wholesale. The girl once dismissed as too strange was suddenly the girl Broadway could not take its eyes off of. And yet, triumph carried its own shadows. With every ovation came whispers of doubt. Critics sneered that she was a fluke. Colleagues gossiped that she didn't belong. The sting of envy and the barbs of ridicule cut just as sharply as the rejections once had. But Barbra clung to the very thing she had been told to hide. The voice that was too strange, the face too imperfect, the will too stubborn. They were not her shame, they were her crown. Even as applause began to surround her, she never forgot the echo she carried inside, the memory of that cold Manhattan room, of tears cried into a pillow, of daring to believe the world might one day see her. By the early 1960s, the girl once ridiculed for her looks had climbed to heights few dared to imagine. At just 19, Barbra Streisand stepped onto the Broadway stage in I Can Get It For You Wholesale. Her role was small, but her presence was volcanic. Audiences could not look away. Critics whispered that a new star had arrived. 2 years later, in 1964, she became the face of Funny Girl on Broadway, turning Fanny Brice into a living reflection of her own story. The awkward, underestimated outsider who triumphed by sheer force of talent. For the first time, Barbra's so-called flaws weren't obstacles. They were her superpower. By 1968, at only 26 years old, she stood before the world, clutching the Academy Award for her film debut as Fanny Brice. She was no longer the shy girl from Brooklyn. She was a woman who had redefined what it meant to be a star. And yet, even in that dazzling moment, Barbra admitted later, "I felt more trapped than free. When you win so young, there's only one way left to go, down." The Oscar that should have been a symbol of liberation instead became a gilded cage. From that night on, every performance had to be perfect. Every note, every costume, every camera angle, every gesture. Perfection became her crown. But it was also her curse. "I couldn't just sing," she confessed years later. "I had to control everything. If it wasn't right, it felt like failure." Exhaustion began to replace joy. The press, far from celebrating her genius, circled like wolves. Throughout the 1970s, as she shattered box office records and collected Grammys, the tabloids branded her as difficult, demanding, even impossible. Comedians mocked her nose. Columnists sneered at her ambition. To the world, she was a goddess. To the media, she was a punchline. For a woman who had grown up starving for affection, every cruel word cut deeper than applause could ever heal. People see the glamour, she reflected, but they don't know the hurt. They don't know how words can wound more than silence. But perhaps the deepest scar of all came in 1967, a year before her Oscar triumph. In front of more than 130,000 people at Central Park, Barbra forgot the lyrics mid-performance. The humiliation was unbearable. Though her voice soared beautifully, her confidence collapsed. "I remember standing there frozen," she admitted. "I couldn't move. I couldn't sing. The fear stayed with me." The result was devastating. For nearly 3 decades, imagine it, 30 years, one of the greatest singers of the 20th century avoided live concerts. The artist whose voice could fill stadiums hid from the very stage that had made her. Not until 1994, at the age of 52, did she dare to return, trembling as she stepped once more into the spotlight after 27 years of silence. Even her boldest victories carried hidden agony. In 1983, she directed, co-wrote, and starred in Yentl, becoming one of the first women in Hollywood to wield such creative power. Though critics praised the film, the backlash was merciless. Male colleagues dismissed her as too ambitious, too controlling, too arrogant. Where men were hailed as visionaries, Barbra was condemned as a tyrant. "I wasn't trying to be powerful," she explained. "I was just trying to tell the story the way it lived inside me." But the double standard was cruel, and the wounds it left never fully healed. Even success itself became a burden. She remains the only artist to top the charts in every decade since the 1960s, but with each album came the same fear. Would this be the one that failed? Would time finally take her place away? So while the world saw gowns, Grammys, and Oscars, Barbra carried something far more fragile: the loneliness of being misunderstood, the suffocating chase for perfection, the ache of wounds that no spotlight could erase. That was the paradox of Barbra Streisand at her peak: glory entwined with torment, triumph laced with fear. She was the star who conquered the world, yet never silenced the echo of doubt inside. And perhaps that is why her story endures, because even at the summit, the air can be thin, the silence deafening, and the crown impossibly heavy. If the stage was where Barbra Streisand proved her strength, then her marriage to actor Elliott Gould was where she discovered just how fragile love could be. They met in the early 1960s, when both were still young actors struggling to find their place in theater. Elliott had a boyish charm, irreverent humor, and an ease that disarmed Barbra. Unlike so many others, he wasn't dazzled or intimidated by her volcanic voice or unconventional beauty. He saw her, not the star, not the outsider, but simply Barbra. "He was the first man who ever really saw me," she later confessed. For a girl who had grown up fatherless, starving for affection, his attention felt like oxygen. In March 1963, at just 21, Barbra married him quietly, without spectacle. Friends whispered it was reckless. She called it survival. Those early years were intimate and ordinary. Their small New York apartments were filled with secondhand furniture, takeout cartons balanced on their knees, and nights that ended in laughter after long rehearsals. For the first time in her life, Barbra felt she belonged, not to an audience, but to one person. But belonging can be fragile. By 1964, her role in Funny Girl had catapulted her to superstardom. Suddenly, the young wife became a global icon. Elliott, himself a talented actor, found his career eclipsed by hers. And as her schedule grew punishing, so did the strain at home. In 1966, their son Jason was born. Barbra adored her baby, yet she was also consumed by recording sessions, film contracts, and relentless touring. Elliott longed for a wife who could be still. Barbra feared that stillness would destroy the dream she had fought so hard to build. "I was torn in two," she admitted years later. "I wanted to be a mother, but I was afraid that if I stopped singing, everything I had built would vanish." Even joy came with fracture. The nursery echoed with Jason's cries while Barbra was on set. Elliot, rocking the baby at 3 a.m., wondered if he was losing his wife to the world. As the late 1960s blurred into the 1970s, their bond began to unravel. Elliot resented the shadow of Barbra's fame. Barbra recoiled from his resentment, convinced it was the price of her ambition. They tried. Weekend escapes, promises of more time, even handwritten notes slipped under doors. But silence always returned. By the time she clutched her Academy Award in 1968, her marriage was already crumbling. The public saw a radiant young woman crowned Queen of Hollywood. Behind closed doors, there were missed dinners, slammed doors, and whispered arguments about who would put Jason to bed. By 1971, it was over. Barbra was 29 years old. To the tabloids, it was just another celebrity divorce. To her, it was something closer to death. "It was like a funeral," she admitted. She had entered marriage desperate to believe that love could heal her childhood wounds. She left it with the ache of knowing that love alone was never enough. Yet out of the wreckage came her salvation. Jason. Motherhood became the role she refused to abandon. She shielded him with a ferocity she had never known for herself. If her childhood had been defined by the absence of love, she vowed her son's life would be different, filled with it. And years later, when Jason came out as gay in the 1990s, Barbra did something few in Hollywood dared to do at the time. She stood by him, publicly, proudly. She became a champion for LGBTQ+ rights, funding advocacy groups, speaking out in interviews, and confronting an industry that preferred silence. "My son taught me courage," she reflected. "He gave me the chance to love without condition, without fear." Through Jason, Barbra discovered a love that did not collapse under ambition or fade under pressure. It was unconditional. It was permanent. Decades later, when asked about Elliot, Barbra did not respond with bitterness. Instead, she spoke with quiet gratitude. "He was my first great love. That never really goes away." For all its fractures, their marriage had given her something irreplaceable. It taught her the fragility of love, the weight of ambition, and the ache of loss. But it also gave her the greatest gift of her life, her son, and with him, a love that fame could never eclipse. The end of her marriage to Elliot Gould had already shown Barbra Streisand how love could crumble under the relentless weight of fame. But life was not done testing her heart. What came next was not the permanence of devotion, but the dangerous allure of passion, whispers of temptation, scandal, and affairs that blurred the line between truth and performance. It was 1968. Barbra's star had never shone brighter. On screen, as Fanny Bryce in Funny Girl, she delivered a performance so electric, so alive, it captured the world. Beside her stood Omar Sharif, the dashing international screen legend whose magnetic charm seemed to mirror her own intensity. Their chemistry was undeniable. Every glance, every laugh, every unscripted touch carried an energy too raw to be confined to script pages. To audiences, it was dazzling magic. To those behind the curtain, it looked dangerously real. The timing could not have been more precarious. Barbra's marriage had collapsed, and her fame had exploded. Suddenly, tabloids devoured every rumor, turning whispers into screaming headlines. What should have been her crowning triumph, the role that crowned her as Hollywood royalty, was shadowed by insinuations of impropriety. But Barbra, who had built her career by refusing to hide, from her voice, from her face, from her ambition, did not deny what was plain for the world to see. Years later, With unapologetic candor, she acknowledged the spark between her and Omar. Fleeting or not, desire, she insisted, deserved to be remembered. In the end, the affair, if it truly was one, flickered out as quickly as it ignited. Omar drifted back into his world. Barbra pressed on in hers. Yet the episode left its scar, a reminder that even at her most untouchable, she was still a woman vulnerable to longing, risk, and the kind of dangerous passion that burns brightest when it cannot last. By the mid-1970s, Barbra had endured a marriage's collapse and the sting of scandal, but what she had not yet known was a love that spoke to her mind as much as her heart. That possibility appeared in the most unlikely of places, through Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the magnetic and fiercely intellectual Prime Minister of Canada. Their worlds could not have been further apart. She, the artist who exposed her soul through song. He, the statesman trained to hide his emotions behind diplomacy and discipline. Yet when they met, there was a spark, not of spectacle, but of recognition. Trudeau was unlike anyone Barbra had ever encountered. Quiet, deliberate, almost mysterious. He did not look at her as an icon or a goddess, but as a woman worth listening to, a mind worth engaging. He made me feel seen in a way applause never did, she later admitted. For someone who had grown up craving not adoration but understanding, that recognition was intoxicating. Their bond unfolded in whispers, private dinners, letters exchanged between impossible schedules, long conversations about art, politics, the burdens of carrying power, his over a nation, hers over a cultural empire. Friends recalled how her laughter disarmed his stoic calm and how his steadiness anchored her restless energy. But as magnetic as their connection was, it could not last. He was bound to his country. She was bound to her stage. Neither could abandon the life they had fought so fiercely to build, and so their love remained suspended, too real to ignore, too fragile to endure. Years later, Barbra would remember Trudeau not with bitterness, but with a wistful admiration. What lingered was not heartbreak, but the ache of an unfinished story. Sometimes, she seemed to suggest, the greatest loves are not the ones that burn brightly and break, but the ones that fade before they ever have the chance to fall apart. If Pierre Trudeau had shown Barbra Streisand the quiet elegance of an intellectual bond, then the 1980s swept her into romances that were the opposite, dazzling, glamorous, intoxicating, but fleeting. By then, Barbra had already been a star for 2 decades. She was no longer just an actress or a singer. She was an institution. Her name carried weight, her presence filled stadiums, and her achievements were unmatched. Yet for all her success, she was still a woman searching for connection, still vulnerable to desire, and in the glittering decade of excess, glamour had a name: Don Johnson. Handsome, charismatic, and fresh off his meteoric rise as the star of Miami Vice, Don embodied everything Hollywood adored in the 1980s. To the tabloids, their romance was irresistible. She, the established queen of stage and screen, and he, the golden-haired heartthrob of the moment. Cameras loved them. Audiences devoured them. For Barbra, it was liberating. With Don, there was no intellectual duel, no heavy expectations, no competition. There was only charm, laughter, and the heady intoxication of youth. Their relationship was a tabloid fantasy: red carpets, premieres, late-night outings under flashing cameras. For once, Barbra seemed to let go of control and allow herself to be swept up in the spectacle. But beneath the dazzle, there was little to anchor them. Don thrived on the adrenaline of celebrity. Barbra longed for depth, for something lasting. Inevitably, the romance fizzled as quickly as it had sparked, not with bitterness, but with inevitability. Looking back, Barbra did not see it as a failure. Instead, She treated it like fireworks on a summer night. Brilliant, unforgettable, but gone before the smoke cleared. Some loves are not meant to endure. They exist only to remind us of passion's fleeting beauty. But if Don Johnson had been the brief flash of Hollywood glamour, then Andre Agassi was something entirely different, a firestorm of audacity and youth that collided with Barbra in the most unexpected way. It was the 1990s, and Barbra had nothing left to prove. She had conquered Broadway, Hollywood, and the music charts. She had survived scandals, heartbreaks, and the crushing weight of perfection. What she had not expected was to find herself at the center of one of the most unlikely romances of the decade. Andre Agassi, the brash tennis prodigy, was 28 years younger than Barbra. He carried the raw energy of youth, the swagger of a global sports icon, and a restlessness that mirrored Barbra's own in her early years. To the tabloids, their pairing was irresistible gossip. To Barbra, it was something else entirely. A chance to love boldly, without apology. Their connection wasn't about matching ages or careers, it was about recognition. Andre, whose life had been defined by competition, confessed to being mesmerized by Barbra's artistry, her depth, her refusal to ever be anything less than authentic. Barbra, in turn, was captivated by his unguarded admiration, by the way he saw her not as an icon, but as a woman worthy of desire. For a time, their romance was intoxicating. Late-night phone calls that stretched until dawn. Stolen moments in public that felt like private rebellions. The thrill of knowing the world was watching, yet refusing to care. But like a match played under too much heat, the intensity could not last. The pressures of fame, the gulf in age, the differences in rhythm eventually pulled them apart. And yet, the affair left Barbra with something priceless. It proved that vulnerability has no expiration date. That passion can find you even when the world insists you've outgrown it. Loving Andre Agassi did not give her permanence, but it gave her courage. The courage to embrace desire without shame, and the grace to let go when the time came. It was a reminder that even legends are not immune to the flames of fleeting passion. And for Barbra Streisand, each romance, whether scandalous, glamorous, or unexpected, left her with lessons that deepened her understanding of love. By the mid-1990s, Barbra Streisand had lived through enough triumph and heartbreak to fill several lifetimes. She had conquered Broadway, Hollywood, and the music world. She had endured a marriage that collapsed under the weight of ambition, survived scandals that shadowed her greatest triumphs, and risked her heart in romances that burned brightly but faded too soon. She had learned again and again that love could be dazzling, intoxicating, even transformative, but rarely enduring. And so by her early 50s, Barbra no longer believed in fairy tales. She guarded her heart with the same ferocity she once guarded her career. And then fate introduced her to James Brolin. It was 1996. Friends arranged their meeting, convinced the two might enjoy each other's company. Neither expected sparks. James was a ruggedly handsome actor, best known for his television and film work. Twice divorced, he carried his own scars. Barbra, tired of superficial small talk and men intimidated by her fame, expected very little. But that first evening held a surprise. When Barbra teased James about his haircut, remarking playfully that it was almost bald, he didn't flinch. Instead, he laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a forced one, but a warm, genuine laugh that disarmed her instantly. For a woman who had spent decades surrounded by men either dazzled by her or threatened by her, James's humor was like a breath of fresh air. He wasn't in awe of Barbra Streisand, the legend. He was charmed by Barbra the woman. Their courtship was refreshingly ordinary. No staged entrances, no tabloid-fueled spectacles. Just dinners filled with conversation, evenings spent talking about art, family, and life. Both had known the storms of failed marriages. Both had scars. but also wisdom. And both had discovered what they no longer wanted: competition, pretense, or drama. James admired Barbra's intensity without trying to tame it, and Barbra found in James a steadiness she had never known before. "He hears me," she said simply. "Not just my voice, but me." 2 years later, on July 1st, 1998, they were married in an intimate ceremony at Barbra's Malibu estate. The celebration was simple but radiant. Roses in full bloom, music floating through the evening air, family and close friends gathered in joy. Barbra wore a shimmering Donna Karan gown, glowing not as a diva before the world, but as a woman who had finally found home. For once, the headlines that followed were not scandalous or mocking. They were celebratory. After years of turbulence, Barbra Streisand had found not just love, but stability. And the years that followed proved it was real. Unlike her past romances, so often consumed by the glare of publicity, her marriage to James was strikingly private. Together they built a life anchored not in fame, but in ordinary joys. Morning coffees at the kitchen table, walks with their dogs along the Malibu cliffs, evenings spent watching movies instead of dazzling premieres. To the world, Barbra was still the icon, the star draped in Grammys and Oscars. But with James, she could exhale. She could be imperfect, vulnerable, simply a wife. They never had children together, but family remained central to their lives. Barbra embraced James's children as her own, particularly his son, actor Josh Brolin. And James, in turn, became a steady, loving presence for Jason Gould, Barbra's son, the bond that was already the most sacred in her life. It wasn't about creating new children together. It was about weaving their families into one, with love at the center. What made their marriage remarkable was not grand gestures, but endurance. 5 years passed, 10 years, 20. While Hollywood relationships came and went like passing seasons, Barbra and James quietly built a partnership admired not for glamour, but for its authenticity. By their silver anniversary, their union was one of Hollywood's most enduring love stories, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Barbra, once consumed by perfectionism, learned to accept the imperfections of daily love, the small annoyances, the inevitable disagreements, the quiet forgiveness. She found freedom in knowing she didn't have to perform in her own marriage. "I was looking for someone for 50 years, she once said, and I finally found him." More than 2 decades after their Malibu wedding, Barbra Streisand and James Brolin remain inseparable. They are not tabloid fixtures, nor do they flaunt their intimacy for the cameras. Their love is measured in quiet gestures, a hand held in public, a kiss shared at an awards ceremony, an arm around each other in the ordinary rhythms of life. For fans who have followed Barbra's long journey through dazzling triumphs and aching heartbreak, this chapter stands as the most beautiful of all. Because after a lifetime of loves that faltered, she finally discovered what she had been searching for since girlhood. Not fantasy, not perfection, but partnership. A love that asked nothing of her but to be herself. A love that endured. A love that gave her peace at last. For Barbra Streisand, love gave her peace, but her surroundings gave her permanence. Every home, every collection, every carefully chosen treasure was more than luxury. They were symbols of survival. Proof that the little girl from Brooklyn, who once slept in a cramped room without privacy, had finally built sanctuaries where she could breathe. Her Malibu estate remains the crown jewel of her world. Spread across multiple houses by the ocean, its rose gardens, koi ponds, and manicured terraces feel less like a fortress and more like a retreat, an artist's utopia crafted with meticulous care. Here she married James Brolin in 1998, choosing intimacy over spectacle. Here she found safety during California wildfires, refusing to abandon her sanctuary. Here she shaped her life into a masterpiece. "My home is my canvas," she once said, and Malibu became the painting where she poured her soul. But Malibu was not her only statement. Her rise left marks across New York City as well. Her Upper East Side townhouse, once valued at $17.5 million, wasn't just a glamorous address. It was a bridge from her modest Brooklyn childhood to Manhattan's elite. For a time, she lived in a penthouse overlooking Central Park, the same city that had once rejected her. To look out over its skyline was to remind herself she had not only survived, she had risen above. Even her cars carried memory and meaning. Her 1962 Bentley S3, all walnut and leather, reflected the elegance she embraced during her funny girl breakthrough. Her 1976 Mercedes-Benz 450 SL symbolized her independence during the years she fought to direct Yentl, a time when Hollywood dismissed ambitious women. And then her prized 1926 Rolls-Royce, restored with meticulous care, stood as a declaration that time itself could be polished and preserved, just as she had preserved her voice, her artistry, and her image against the erosion of decades. But perhaps her most unusual creation was the private museum she built beneath her Malibu estate, a curated collection of Americana, dolls, vintage furniture, and rare artifacts, quirky, eccentric, perhaps even obsessive, yet profoundly Barbra. "I like to live with history," she admitted. Preserving these objects was, in a way, preserving herself. She gave dignity to the forgotten and beauty to the overlooked, just as she had once been underestimated, and then forced the world to see her. To outsiders, her homes and collections might appear like extravagance, but to those who look closer, they are something else entirely. They are milestones, fortresses against insecurity, answers to a childhood spent in scarcity. Every rose garden, every polished hood ornament, every piece of furniture rescued and restored was a rebuttal to the poverty and ridicule she endured. Today, with a net worth of more than $400 million, she stands among the wealthiest performers in Hollywood history. Yet her fortune is not just numbers on a balance sheet. It lives in the estates she designed as sanctuaries, in the automobiles preserved like artifacts, in the museum curated as a testament to resilience. Her wealth is not a monument to ego, but to endurance. Not indulgence, but survival. And perhaps that is why her legacy feels so different. She did not simply hoard luxury, she transformed it into art, into memory, into meaning. Her homes were not prisons to keep the world away, but stages upon which she could finally live on her own terms. Because in truth, the truest wealth she built cannot be measured in dollars or property lines. It is found in the laughter shared with James Brolin over breakfast, in the quiet evenings with her son Jason, in the peace of knowing that after decades of struggle, she had finally created a home where her heart could rest. For all the trophies, the fortune, the standing ovations, Barbra Streisand's life reveals a simple truth. It was never applause that defined her, but love. The stage is dim. The Oscars gather dust. The records eventually slip down the charts. What remains, what endures, is the arithmetic of love. Whom you chose, whom you held, whom you lifted. Barbra's journey taught her that love is not the thunder of dazzling beginnings, but the quiet discipline of staying. It is showing up when the cameras are gone, listening when pride wants to shout, protecting what is fragile even when the world is cruel. From the ache of her childhood, she learned how to survive without love. From her first marriage, she learned how ambition can fracture devotion. From motherhood, she discovered the courage to love unconditionally. And from her later years with James Brolin, she finally found the steadiness of a love that did not demand performance, but simply allowed her to be herself. Her arc is not just that of an artist, it is that of a woman who turned wounds into wisdom. She took the silence of her fatherless childhood and transformed it into music that gave voice to millions. She turned the rejection of critics into proof that flaws could be fire. She turned personal heartbreak into advocacy, standing up for her son and, through him, for countless others in the LGBTQ+ community. Wealth can buy houses, but only love can make them home. Talent can open doors, but only love lets others inside. Fame can amplify a message, but only love makes it worth saying. Barbra Streisand's legacy is not merely a catalog of achievements, it is a way of living. Unyielding in truth, generous in spirit, tender without apology. She reminds us that a life is well lived when the heart learns three things: to receive love without fear, to give love without measure, and to transform private healing into public good. That is why her story lingers, why her music still echoes long after the final note. Because Barbra Streisand, for all her glamour and genius, never stopped searching for love, and in doing so, taught us how to find it within ourselves. And now, her story turns to us. Which chapter of her journey speaks most to you? The courage to begin, the humility to stay, or the grace to give? If her voice ever steadied you in a hard season, if her story ever lit a fire in your own, honor that by leaving your reflection. On a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate not just Barbra Streisand the artist, but Barbra Streisand the human being? And why? Because in the end, her legacy is not just in the music she gave us, but in the love she dared to live.